Hello everybody, I'm Jonathan. This is A Better Question, and today we're doing worst questions for our They Taught What in Schools Until When episode. These videos are a place to put some of the more tangential but interesting stuff I learned while doing the research for the related episode. Think of these as a better question after work and out for a drink with friends, if you can remember what that was like. I'm not super sure if the stuff in this episode qualifies as worst questions or just other questions, but I committed to a theme, and so here we go. Doing the research for the last episode was heavy, actually. Looking at article after article, if any of them had comment sections, man, people were spicy. Most of those comments were just, you and your and your and your everyone you've ever your dreams and too, which isn't really an argument, so I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with those comments. But besides, just undiluted anger, I saw a lot of people trying to explain away some of the information that they were getting. There was one argument that I didn't get to, and it's by far the weirdest argument for the position that the Confederacy wasn't bad in XYZ way. This argument essentially says, hey, it couldn't have been as bad as you're saying. Black people fought for the Confederacy, or in some other comments, there were black members of the KKK. What I've found sort of funny about this argument is that you never see it as a complete thought. It never says, hey, there were black Confederate soldiers, and therefore it is reasonable to conclude that the Confederacy was not as bad as you are saying that they were, because people wouldn't choose to fight for and support a group that is actively abusing them. All you ever get is the first part. It's just, hey, black people fought for the Confederacy, so there. I don't think it's a coincidence that you never see the follow-up. You don't see the argument made, just the statement. It's not that 100% of the time the people who are saying this stuff get tired of typing at the exact same point. It's more likely that if you're looking for a reason not to investigate any further and you hear, but the Confederacy had a black friend, you're out. That is the expedient escape exit that you've been looking for. Also, it's not true because, of course it isn't. At least not in a way that supports the argument that they're making. There is a shred of truth to this. It comes from New Orleans in 1861. Nolens probably had the largest population of free non-white people in America at the time, which had a lot to do with the fact that it had only been American for 50 years by 1860. Before that, the city was Spanish, and before that, it was French. And the French outlawed slavery in 1794 for a bit. Then Napoleon showed up, but then they re-abolished it in 1848. There was a very large mixed race population and culture in the city of New Orleans, robust enough that there was still a large and affluent non-white population in the city in the 1860s. So at the start of the Confederacy, when Louisiana, bailed and put out a call for troops to come defend the state, about 1,000 or 1,500 prominent free non-white citizens of New Orleans formed a regiment and then offered their services to the governor, who immediately accepted, and the Louisiana Native Guards were born. The group was put under the control of white officers, provided no uniforms, no weapons, and then they were disbanded in 1862 when Louisiana passed a law that said all militia troops had to be white. So the Louisiana Native Guards were a thing for 9 or 10 months, and they never saw combat. Well, or at least they never saw combat for the Confederacy. New Orleans, the city, was blockaded and then surrendered to the US Navy in 1862. Several former members of the Confederate Louisiana Native Guard joined the US Army. One man in the group held the rank of lieutenant and was actually killed in 1863 fighting the Confederacy at Fort Harrison. The name of his unit at that point was the 1st Louisiana Native Guards, US Army version. Another officer has the distinction of being the first and probably last black Jewish officer in the entire Confederate military, and also the first black Jewish officer in the United States military. The thing is, out of this isolated case of not fighting, there's really no indication that black Southerners, enslaved or otherwise, occupied combat roles for the Confederacy. They weren't allowed to, so the claim itself is a bit ludicrous. Some members of the Confederate military general staff began to suggest the enlistment of enslaved persons into the military as early as 1863. The one guy whose idea this mainly was told to never talk about it again and to burn all the copies of his proposal. But as things got progressively worse over the next few years for the Confederacy, State governments and the Confederate Congress kept having people float this idea of using slaves as combat troops. There were really three schools of thought on this among Southern generals and politicians. The frontline generals, including Lee, eventually, were basically like, well, shit. Pretty much anyone who is able keeps running off to the north, and we keep running into our former slaves in battle. Some Southern generals were saying, look, we should figure out a way to have our slaves fight for us, because otherwise they'll be fighting against us pretty soon. Then there was the second group that was like, okay, but like, how do we do that? Do we pay them? Do we order them? Do we offer them freedom? And no one really came up with a super good answer for that, actually, which kept giving ammunition to the third group that was basically like, are you kidding me? This was by far the largest group, at least initially. Howell Cobb, remember that guy? Millie Rutherford's uncle. He was at the time himself a general in the Confederacy, said, "You cannot make soldiers of slaves or slaves of soldiers. The day you make soldiers of them is the beginning of the revolution. If slaves will make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong." Forget it. As ignorant or crazy defenses tend to do, this one also comes with proof. They'll say, well, what about pictures like this one? Yeah, so remember the part where people had slaves? That guy literally owns that guy. However this picture happened, only one person in this picture can tell the other person no. And that poses a problem for the implied argument, which is that non-white people fought for the Confederacy, and therefore it is somehow less of a moral abomination. So putting it all together, they didn't and they couldn't. But also, what? Pretend this claim is true for just a moment. See if this logic holds up. If people were having a conversation about Nazis and somebody said, hey, I think Nazis are bad because Holocaust, among other reasons, would you reply, hey now, there were Jewish people in the Nazi military? And if you did say that, what would be your point? Would it be that because there were Nazis of Jewish descent, that the regime's effort to systematically eradicate that same group of people is somehow less insanely evil? That is a just bonkers point to try to make, but I don't see anything else that that kind of statement could imply. Look, I don't have the experience, thankfully, to talk about how impossibly complicated it must be to live in a society that is actively violent towards your participation in that society. Never mind, your existence generally. Human history is filled with huge groups of people dealing with trauma in every way imaginable. There's never a uniform reaction by every member of a group. Terrible thing A plus an individual equals reaction B through every alphabet ever, including whatever letter Prince was for a little bit. But whatever reaction you end up with, A was the same every time. If symbolic logic, ain't your thing, say someone demands all your money at gunpoint. Nothing you do next changes the fact that mugging someone is a shitty thing to do. That was a way easier explanation. This episode got super dark. On a lighter note, this guy is E. Merton Coulter. This guy sucks. E. Mert over here was the head of the Georgia Historical Society for 40 years. All his accomplishments are spelled out in his entry on the Civil Rights Digital Library, hosted on the University System of Georgia's domain. The Cliff Notes version is basically, this guy is the father of modern Georgian history. He taught at the flagship university for friggin' ever. He was the chair of the history department for 18 years. He edited this Georgia historical magazine for 50 years. He wrote 26 books, 10 edited volumes, more than 100 articles. He did a bunch of book reviews and newspaper columns, and he founded the Southern Historical Association, was its first president in 1934, and helped the thing get off the ground. That was the entire entry. But as I'm sure you've figured out, not all that this guy was up to. I'm just gonna quote him for a second. Egbert said, "In my teachings, I am still trying to reestablish the Southern Confederacy." His junior high textbook for the state of Georgia, which is why I found him in the first place, taught children that slavery greatly benefited Southern blacks and that emancipation had negatively altered their condition. He said that people in the South did not believe the Negroes would know how to vote. And of course, like most Dunning School academics, when he says people, he only means some. He also said that Georgians should have done whatever they could to prevent Negroes voting and from sending representatives to the legislature. Yeah, so they did, man. They tried that. That last quote, by the way, comes from a book he published in 1969. Before you get, this isn't going to be another point-by-page examination of a racist historian. I'm frankly all funned out from Millie Rutherford. But I think you can imagine the influence this guy had over an entire state's education system for like 5 decades. I mean, just look at everything he did. You know, everything it says on his encyclopedia entry. Everything it says on the Civil Rights Digital Library's website. You're just gonna leave out the whole raging racist douche canoe parts, huh? Yeah, so that. Turns out they have a leave a comment section. All I did was show them what their page initially said, dropped in some quotes from Elmert, and politely noted that according to his own words and actions, bringing back an oppressive racist ideology was his life's purpose. Undoubtedly, his body of work is probably a big steaming pile of effort toward that goal. And, you know, probably his entry should mention that. I got a reply the same day, they changed it. That experience is why I brought up Rutherford Hall at the University of Georgia in the last episode. Because sometimes if you bring enough attention to the crappy thing, it gets fixed. Or at least made a bit better. Thanks, everyone. I know that these aren't as popular as the major episodes or as informative or as well-sourced, but they are a lot shorter and more digestible and easier to make. So if you like these, let me know and I'll keep doing them. If you think they're the worst thing ever, I won't, but you should tell me that. Making these doesn't really delay the next major episode by more than a day or two. And it does allow me to put out more content. I'll do a community post about this too and throw up a poll. So let me know what you think in the comments or on the poll or both if you're awesome. The next episode I think is going to be, it should be, the Monuments episode finally. I think people who aren't from the United States are feeling a little neglected. So I might do another episode in between now and the last Monuments episode. And if I do, I think it's going to be on hackers and how they are, for all intents and purposes, the next weapons of mass destruction. Whatever I do next, if it's not the Monuments episode, that will be the one after. Share episodes around, talk about them, do the things that you do if you want. Thanks for giving me your time and your views. I appreciate you. Take care. Which you can use to give yourself lymphoma. Gross. Which you can do. Gasoline is a decent way to haul.